I don't know if it's exclusive to our corner of the United States, but I do know my division within the Park Service is a bit untraditional. We help keep the parks clean, of course. We root out the teenagers that get too rowdy, and we cooperate with the fire department when lightning strikes the wrong tree. But we have another responsibility. It's a team of myself and 13 others. There's an official name for us that I can't share, but amongst ourselves, we're called the Finders. What we do is find the things that no one in their right mind wants to look for. Scary things do live in the national parks. Scary things live everywhere, as a matter of fact. It's thanks to the United States government that in our areas, we can preserve the beautiful sides of nature while stopping the spread of her nastier inhabitants. There's a lick of truth in a lot of the weird stories that come out of these parks. I've got a story of my own. Unfortunately, this story does start with tragedy. I think the greatest lessons all begin with something of that scope. Something has to be lost for something to be learned. Anyway, a hiker had gone missing. This was roughly 15 years ago. We'd recovered their campsite, but there wasn't any sign of the individual in question. More mysteriously, their tent was recovered some 100 yards from the campsite itself. The structure was in ruins, shredded into thin strips of fabric. The metal beams that formed its shape were bent and broken. Theories were rampant regarding how the tent could have traveled so far. Those of us in the Finders knew it was likely that something had dragged it. The wind hadn't been strong enough to move the tent that far, let alone to tie the metal stakes into knots. Hopes of finding the hiker in one piece were fizzling out. The rest of the Park Service was busy looking for them while we were tasked with finding whatever could have taken her. We had our theories, of course. I'm sure by now you've heard stories about the strange creatures living in our national parks. Draw one of their names out of a hat, and we likely considered them a suspect. We needed to be more concerned with evidence than theories, though. There weren't any footprints or drag marks leading out of the campsite, although some unreliable prints had been picked up leading into the space. They were larger than the hikers by a large margin, but the ground had been too hard that day to form a reliable cast. We were working off of indentations in the grass and leaves. After scouring the ground and turning up empty-handed, we looked up. We found fur in the trees, oddly enough, and a branch some 20 feet above the campground that had recently been broken. Quickly, one of our theories jumped ahead of the pack. We traced a line from the campsite to the place where the tent was recovered. We checked the trees all along that path. More broken branches, and in one case, a torn piece of fabric likely ripped from our missing hiker. Whatever had taken them had grabbed them, tent and all, carried them into the trees, and then leaped from branch to branch. It sounded impossible. What could be so strong and so nimble? We were determined to find out. When the rest of the Park Service discovered the hiker, surprisingly in stable condition, we had another point to investigate. The other team cleared out quickly, more concerned with the hiker's well-being than with our monster hunt. But we noticed it right away, the details they had missed. They had pulled her out of a den. The area smelled faintly of urine and animal hide. We could see 3 locations where the brush had been gathered and pressed flat into makeshift beds. There was a mound of earth where something had recently been dug up and buried. Before we had any more time to investigate, the creatures who lived there came home. There was a knocking on a nearby tree. How a man might knock on his own door when he's left the key inside. When we looked, we saw a flash of broad shoulders and fur diving deeper into the woods. Then a howl came from the opposite direction. We spun around, trying to chase the furry shapes in the trees with our eyes. When the next sound came from above us, we froze. It was the whine of wood bending beyond its limit. We knew what that meant. At least one of them was above us. We looked up to see massive feet folded around one of the branches. The man-shaped beast was hunched on the branch, looking down at us with an open mouth and wide eyes. We sprayed bear spray into the wind and started to run. We hoped it would be enough to disorient whatever we had seen. Sure enough, it worked. We safely arrived back at our local office and filed a report about our encounter. We made plans to journey back into the woods and to investigate the creatures, to determine why they had attacked. When we got back, they weren't there. They tossed their own nest, unburied whatever had been hidden in the mound, and disappeared. That's why this story gets told, even though it might not have the most action and it might not be the most fun. I tell this story because we still don't have the answers. We're still scratching our heads about it all these years later. That's our responsibility, you know? We're the ones who find the answers. I tell this story because it's the one that ends with a warning. And if I don't warn you, there's a chance that no one will. If you're out in the woods, keep your head on a swivel, secure your perimeter, and remember to look up. I'm a semi-truck driver, and most of my routes take me across the South through Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. During one of my routes, I stopped at a Love's truck stop near New Orleans. This one had a Subway in it, and while I was eating my usual roast beef sandwich, this old man came up to me. I figured he wanted money since I didn't know him. I gave him a couple bucks, but he didn't leave. He started saying crazy stuff. I should have left, but I just sat there and listened to him. I guess I was bored. He was talking about something called a loup-garou, which he said meant werewolf. Said it goes after little kids who are bad, stuff like that. Looks like a dog that walks on its back legs and smells like rotten eggs. Howls at night. I was really starting to wonder how to best get away from this guy at this point. The guy seemed totally serious. I mean, it was obvious that he really believed in this stuff, but I thought it was BS. Just an old story people used to tell their kids to keep them in line. You know, like, be good or the loup-garou will get you. Well, I did manage to get away from him, but I've come to believe that that dude really did see something and it drove him crazy. I'll tell you why. One night a few months later, I stopped at the Rest Stop Welcome Center near the Louisiana-Mississippi border. If you haven't seen it, it's supposed to look like an old plantation house or something. It's white or off-white with pillars in front. During the day, volunteers sit in there and hand out maps and free coffee. There's a bank of vending machines out to the side in a little shack, and that part plus the bathrooms are both open 24 hours. Behind it, there's woods, I guess. It's pretty busy during the day with trucks and cars coming and going, people walking dogs, all that. But at night, it's a different story. The night I saw the thing, I'd been driving too long. You're supposed to stop after 14 hours, absolute max, according to FMCSA rules. But we all know how to push the limits, and I'd been going at least an hour longer than that. So when I got out of the truck, I was stumbling a little. I headed for the main building first, you know, where the restrooms are. They're open 24 hours, and I guess it was around midnight. It's pretty well lit normally, but some of the lights near the back of the building look to be burned out. The entrance to the restroom is kind of outside, just in this outdoor hallway, really. I thought it was weird that the lights were out. They're careful about that usually because of safety. So as I walked toward the restroom entrance, it was really dark. I used the restroom. When I came out, I noticed that all the other cars and trucks had left except one that was way far back from my truck. That was weird too because it's a nice rest area and truckers try to stop there if they can time it right. I wanted to leave, but I really needed a Coke if I was going to keep driving. So I walked over to the outside vending machine area. The lights were on, and I got a Coke and some Fritos. I started back to my truck and that old dude's story just popped into my head. I don't know why, but it was almost like I could picture that loup-garou he described. I looked over at the other side of the Welcome Center. There's mowed grass and picnic tables there, but behind the road that leads out of the rest area, it's forest. Some of the lights out that way were out too. Anything could live in that woods, really. The trees get thick real quick. And I remembered the old man said, the loup-garou lives in the forest or the swamp. That's when I heard the howl. It didn't sound like a dog or a coyote. I heard them before, and this was more human-like. Well, really like in between a human and a wolf or something. I turned around quick because it sounded like it came from behind me, back behind the restroom entrance past that dark hallway. I should have started running, but I was afraid if I did, it might follow me. I thought if I stood still, maybe it would go away. While I was looking, one of those lights snapped on. You know how those fluorescents do sometimes? It flashed like lightning almost, and I swear I saw a dog standing up. It was just behind the building near where some of the trees started. That thing was tall, taller than me for sure. I was glad I was pretty far away, and the light near me hadn't gone on. I thought maybe it didn't see me. Maybe it did, though, because it threw back its head, and I saw that long snout pointing toward the dark sky. It howled again, louder this time, and then that light near it popped back off. I was actually more scared when I couldn't see it anymore. I remembered the old dude saying the loup-garou could run fast. I thought it could be running toward me in the dark. That thought got me moving, and I ran to my truck, got in, and locked the doors. The engine's loud, but after I started it, over the rumbling, I swear I heard another howl, closer. I shifted gears and got out of there as fast as I could. I haven't been to that rest area since. So it was a while back on a Friday night when I got a call about some rowdy teenagers causing a commotion. Now, in these parts, we'd often deal with kids disturbing the peace, especially on weekends. You know how it goes, small-town blues, not much to do, so they go out looking for trouble. Usually just the sight of my squad car was enough to make them straighten up. But this time, it was different. The complaint came from a neighbor living near a stretch of densely wooded hiking trails at the edge of town. These trails were about 14 miles long, and they weren't exactly well maintained, but people still liked to venture into the woods. Now, there was a creek flowing through those woods, used to be a proper river back in the day, but it had dried up quite a bit. Funny how nature works, I can't explain it. Anyway, there was this old mill from the late 1800s near the creek. It had turned into a hangout spot for local teenagers, a place to drink and party. Last time I checked, that mill was a mess, full of empty cans, bottles, and graffiti. These kids thought they were far enough into the forest to avoid getting caught, but here's the thing. There were homes surrounding those woods, and people living there could hear all the racket. So as the sheriff, it was my duty to check it out. I hopped in my squad car and headed towards the woods. When I arrived, I noticed there weren't any cars in the public parking lot nearby, but that didn't mean those clever teenagers hadn't parked elsewhere and walked in. Armed with my trusty flashlight, I made my way into the woods. Almost immediately, I could hear the laughter and shouting of the kids. They didn't sound too far off, certainly not far enough to be at the mill. At first, I thought they were on my left, but as I tried to follow the sounds, they shifted to my right. I called out, telling them to cut it out, but no one answered. Now, I knew those kids had spotted me, and they were probably scrambling as fast as they could. Despite that, I decided to continue towards the mill because that's where the neighbor claimed the lights and screams were coming from. Who knows? Maybe there was still something going on there. As I walked deeper into the forest, it grew eerily quiet. The trail was overgrown, but I managed to find my way, guided by the beam of my flashlight. That's when I heard the voices again, just like before. They were screaming and laughing, but I couldn't make out any words. I pointed my flashlight towards the mill, but it was empty. Those kids were somewhere out there in the woods, but I couldn't pinpoint their exact location. The voices seemed to be coming from all directions, yet they sounded both distant and close at the same time. It sent shivers down my spine and made me question what I was dealing with. Curiosity got the better of me, and I shined my light into the woods. That's when I saw it, multiple lights reflecting back at me. At first I thought they were just flashlights, but upon closer inspection, I realized they were eyes. There must have been at least a dozen pairs of eyes, all at my eye level. They stayed hidden in the shadows, so I couldn't get a clear glimpse of their faces, but what I could see was their ghostly white skin. Those voices, they sounded human, but seeing those eyes, I knew there was something off about them. They weren't your ordinary teenagers, that's for sure. Slowly, I started backing away down the trail. I didn't want to run and risk provoking those things to chase after me. It was a chilling experience, to say the least. As I retreated, I couldn't resist shining my flashlight once more at the mill. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wasn't thinking straight at that point. But what I saw made my blood run cold. The whole dilapidated building lit up with eyes. I didn't stick around to count them, but there were at least 10 more pairs of those eerie eyes in there. The voices continued to follow me, echoing through the trees as I made my way back to my car. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever encountered. They seemed to come from all directions, some close by, others far away. It was as if they were trying to lure me off the trail or get me hopelessly lost. Now, I'm not a religious person, but in that moment, I found myself praying to every deity I could think of just to make it safely back to my car. Miraculously, I managed to find my way out, following the trail back. I was shaken to the core by the time I reached my car. I rushed back to the station and locked myself inside for the rest of my shift. I didn't know what to put in the report, as I never had a chance to speak to the person who made the complaint. It was just a message left on the answering machine at the station. I tried calling the number back, but it was disconnected. I decided to classify it as a dangerous black bear sighting in the woods, and we even put up barricades to keep people away from that area. I had no clue what those things truly were, but I knew one thing for certain. They weren't anything good. It was my responsibility to protect the folks in the community, so keeping them away from those creatures became my top priority. A few years back, I used to pitch in and help my cousin who owns this massive apple orchard up in Washington. I mean, this place was so big it felt like you could walk for miles and still be surrounded by apple trees, and it was right on the edge of a dense forest. He had several workers to help maintain the orchard and run the cider mill. The orchard was a major attraction, especially during the apple picking season. People would pay a pretty penny to come and pick their own apples, enjoy some freshly pressed cider, have a good old country time. So one time, a couple of his regular workers had to take some time off, and he needed someone to fill in. I said, sure, why not? And he brought me up there for a few days to help out. Now, there were several sections in the orchard, and several little huts scattered around. It was my job to check on the trees, make sure no pests were getting to them, and also help out at the cider mill. The really prized apples were tagged, and the price he charged depended on the variety and the size of the apples. He had some really special varieties there. One evening, I'm doing my rounds. It's around 5 p.m. As the sun started to set, the irrigation system kicked in, watering the trees. I was checking on the trees, making sure the apples were growing nicely. The sun was setting just as I was finishing up. It was early fall, and it got dark pretty quick. I was just about to call it a day when I heard this rustling sound coming from behind one of the huts. I figured it was just some critter, maybe a squirrel or something, but it sounded bigger. I closed the hut door and peeked out the window to see if I could spot anything. I shined my flashlight around, but didn't see anything. The rustling got louder, and I tried to look through the window again, but my flashlight was so weak it was practically useless. I had forgotten to charge it before I left, and the battery was almost gone. Knowing I couldn't see anything, I figured I should just head back. But just as I was about to leave, I heard this strange cawing sound. It wasn't like any bird I'd heard before. It was kind of high-pitched, and to be honest, it sounded kind of eerie. Whatever it was outside the hut and sounded like it was moving around in the trees. Now I'd heard of sightings of large owls in Washington, but those stories were not very common. And this didn't sound like any owl I'd ever heard. The sound would caw and then almost turn into a hiss. So I decided to just stay put in the hut for a bit and not risk running into whatever was out there in the dark. I used to really enjoy helping my cousin out, but this time it felt like I'd gotten myself into a situation I hadn't bargained for. As I sat in the hut, that strange sound seemed to be getting louder, and I was getting more and more spooked. I tried to see what was going on outside, but it was tough to make anything out with the moon only half full. Then I saw something move. Something big was fluttering around just outside the hut. I mean, it's hard to even believe what I'm about to tell you, even though I was the one who saw it. This thing, it was huge, like a good 7 or 8 feet wide, and it didn't look normal. It was like a bird, but not any bird I'd ever seen or heard of. It had a giant wingspan, and its feathers were a deep, eerie black that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. The body seemed more elongated than a typical bird, and the head was somewhat reptilian, with 2 glowing eyes that burned an intense yellow in the darkness. The creature was perched in a nearby tree, its talons gripping the branch with an unsettling intensity. It seemed to be examining the apple trees, its gaze lingering on the ripe apples that hung from the branches. I was frozen, my breath caught in my throat. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what this creature could be. Was it some kind of mutant bird, an unknown species, or something more supernatural? Then, to my utter disbelief, the creature reached out with a long skeletal hand. Yes, a hand, not a talon, but a hand, with thin, elongated fingers that ended in sharp claws. It plucked an apple off a tree, and I watched in stunned silence as it lifted the apple to its beak-like mouth and took a bite. I nearly fainted at the sight. This wasn't just some bird, but some kind of hybrid. A creature from a world that wasn't supposed to exist, right here in my cousin's orchard. The creature seemed to enjoy the apple, its eerie eyes closing for a moment as it savored the fruit. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was paralyzed with fear. I knew I had to get out of there, but I also knew I had to be careful. One wrong move, and I could alert this creature to my presence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the creature finished the apple. It let out another one of those eerie caws, and then, with a powerful flap of its wings, it launched itself into the air and disappeared into the night. I remained in the hut for a while longer, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, I sprinted all the way back to my cousin's house. I told him what I saw, but he didn't believe me at first. He thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But when we went back to the orchard the next day, we found the apple core from the tree where I had seen the creature. From then on, we made sure to finish up our work before sunset. I still don't know what that creature was, and I don't think I ever will. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night in the orchard. All right, let me tell you a story that happened to me. I used to be buddies with this guy who had a massive fish farm down in Louisiana. I mean, this place was so big it seemed like it went on forever. And it was right on the edge of the bayou. He had a bunch of fish ponds on his property. The whole idea was to attract and keep fish for harvesting. People would pay good money to come and fish for a prize catch, like a big old catfish or something. So his regular guy fell ill and he needed someone to take care of the place and make sure everything was running smoothly. I said, sure, why not? And he brought me down there for a few days to help out. There were a bunch of ponds and several little huts scattered around the property. It was my job to check on the fish in the morning and the evening. The prize fish were tagged and the price he charged depended on the size of the fish. He had some real whoppers in there. One evening I'm doing my rounds. It's around 5 p.m. As the sun started to set, the feeding machines kicked in and started dropping food into the ponds. I started counting the fish as they came up to eat. The fish were done feeding just as the sun was going down. It was early winter, and it got dark really quick. I was just about to wrap up for the night when I heard this splashing sound coming from behind one of the huts. I figured the fish were done eating, but maybe they were still hungry or something. I closed the hut door and peeked out the window to see if any fish were coming up to feed. I shined my flashlight out on the water to see if I could spot any ripples or anything, but I didn't see anything. The splashing got louder. I tried to look through the window again, but my flashlight was so dim it was useless. I had forgotten to charge it before I left and the battery was almost gone. Knowing I couldn't see anything, I figured I should just head back. But just as I was about to leave, I heard this strange gurgling sound. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It was kind of high-pitched and, honestly, it sounded kind of scary. Whatever it was outside the hut and sounded like it was swimming around in the pond. Now I'd heard tales of gators being spotted in the bayou, but those stories were few and far between. And this didn't sound like any gator I'd ever heard. The sound would gurgle and then almost turn into a growl. So I figured I'd just stay in the hut for a bit and not risk running into whatever was out there in the dark. I used to really enjoy helping my buddy out, but it felt like this time I'd signed up for a bit more than I bargained for. As I sat in the hut, that strange sound seemed to be getting louder, and I was getting more and more spooked. I tried to see what was going on outside, but it was tough to make anything out with the moon only half full. Then I saw something move. Something big was swimming around just outside the hut. I mean, it's hard to even believe what I'm about to tell you, even though I was the one who saw it. This thing, it was huge, like a good 7 or 8 feet long, and it looked, well, it didn't look normal. It was like a cross between a human and a gator, with a head that looked kind of like a snake. My heart was racing as I realized that I was dealing with something that didn't seem to belong in our world. I tried to keep calm while I watched the creature swim around the pond. I could make out its eyes that were glowing yellow in the dark, and I just knew this thing was smart and I needed to stay sharp. It seemed to be searching for something, and I had this feeling that if it found me, I would be in big trouble. As the hours ticked by, I stayed hunkered down inside the hut, hoping that the creature would eventually lose interest and leave. But I had this nagging feeling it knew I was there, and I didn't know how much longer I could stay hidden. Man, I was kicking myself for not bringing a gun or something with me. Mostly I stayed hidden, but every now and then I would peek out. After what felt like forever, I saw it stop and start sniffing the water or something. Suddenly, something shot out from the reeds and started splashing around. I was frozen watching it and realized it was unnatural. The gator snake thing immediately sprang into action and went after the nutria. The poor thing was trying to escape, making all kinds of noise, and then nothing. All sound stopped, and I'm sure it got caught. I didn't waste any time getting out of the hut and into my truck that was about 100 feet away. I drove out of there like a bat out of hell. When I got to my cabin, I felt like I had run a marathon. I had one of the worst nights of my life, just lying there, unable to sleep, going over and over in my mind what that thing could have been. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as I could. Come morning, I was out of there. I called my buddy and told him I didn't know what the hell was in his pond, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I left that place and haven't been back since.